So here is where I work. I work at the Eddy Discovery Center at Waterloo Recreation Area. And Waterloo is about halfway between Jackson and Ann Arbor. And so it's a really big park. It's our most biologically diverse park in the lower part of the state. And it has a lot of natural features or landforms. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So here is the visitor center that I work at, the Eddy Discovery Center. We do programs and all kinds of activities, and there's a lot of things for people to see there. So if you want to come and visit me, you can come and visit my park. So one of the things that the Natural Resources Department does is make sure that the lands that are managed by the state of Michigan are protecting habitat for threatened and endangered species. They also manage the lands for resource use. So that includes resources like gravel and sand mining. It also includes timber harvest. And then for individual families, it can be somewhere where you can get wood for your fire at home, or use it as a recreational opportunity. So there's a lot of people that come to our park and they use our trail systems, whether it's for mountain biking or camping or hunting or fishing. And so those are really three of the reasons that we manage the state-owned lands for the people of our state. So there's a lot of scientists that work for the department, and they're all doing interesting work. Some of them are protecting lands or making habitats better for animals or plants. Some of them are doing research. All of them are working together and coordinating their efforts. So in Waterloo, we actually have some really interesting landforms, and we'll talk about why we have these landforms. I hope this loads so you can get an idea of the landscape that we're talking about. So this is one of our new trails. This is the DTE Energy Trail. This is the Sugar Loop. So it's one of the more difficult loops that you'll find at Waterloo. And you can see this guy is going pretty fast down some winding hill. And off to the left, you can actually see a glimpse of a lake. And then you can see downhill, there's some forested areas, and uphill. So lots of habitats and interesting topography or landscape landforms that we have in our park. It's going to take just a second. And the reason that we have that is we used to be covered with ice. So during the last ice age, which ended about 10,000 years ago, Michigan had ice covering most of the land. And so this wasn't just thin ice. This is a pretty heavy, thick ice that was formed over hundreds of thousands of years. We were just a little bit colder, and so farther north, we would have temperatures that wouldn't allow all of the snow that fell in the winter to melt away in the summer. So we would have this thickening of ice year after year after year, and that thick ice actually oozes or squashes under its own weight, and it oozes across the land. So you can imagine it being thicker up near the polar ice caps, and then over time, kind of squeezing and oozing across Canada, and then down through Michigan. So as it oozed, it would pluck or pick up rock and sand and move it along on its journey. And those deposits ended up in Michigan. So this is what we call our surface geology. And the surface geology of Michigan is really just piles of rock and sand and silts that were deposited here from that last ice age. So let me show you where I work. This is Waterloo in that red circle. So the dark green upside down Y shape is like our hills or our moraines. And those hills help make the topography that was so great for that mountain biker. So here we have kind of a picture of what it might have looked like when the ice was melting away. So this is actually a retreating glacier. So the retreating glacier up here is melting away. That's what retreating means. And here's some of that till or rock and sand that was picked up in Canada and deposited here in Michigan. We call this a moraine. And then you can see this long skinny hill here. This is an end moraine. So that ice probably spent a lot of time moving backwards and forwards there and depositing larger pieces of till or sand and rock there. Some other landforms that we see in Waterloo are this esker here. So an esker is like a long skinny meltwater channel full of rock and sand. And it would have been sort of like a tunnel of meltwater rushing through that glacier and depositing all of its pieces or till right in this long skinny esker. There's also these things called Kettle Lake. So we have quite a few Kettle Lakes in Waterloo. And those are basically ice blocks that were broken off of the main body of Glacier. They kind of settle in one spot, and then they make this kind of self-contained lake or little pot of water on the landscape. And the self-containment happens because that rock and sand and silt and clay that were in the glacier kind of settle to the bottom and seal it off. So they're rain fed from now on, and then they just kind of stay as a lake. So this is a continental glacier that's melting right now, and you can kind of see those same landforms that we saw in the diagram. So here's a long skinny esker, right? And here we have a couple of Kettle Lakes that have formed. And the ice is melting away, but you can see how it looks dirty, right? So it's got lots of rock and sand inside of it. So as it melts away, it's depositing all of the material that was inside the glacier as it retreats. So this here, this little boardwalk, this is my bog trail, or the boardwalk that goes out into a bog, which is a kind of a unique habitat. And so this little lake, Little Cedar Lake, is a Kettle Lake, and Kettle Lakes are, those leftover ice blocks. Oftentimes on the edges of a Kettle Lake, you'll have like a mat of moss that forms what we call a bog. So the moss, the sphagnum moss, turns into a mat, and it kind of covers over part of the lake and turns into a bog. So we're going to visit my bog here. And as you can see, it's kind of in a low-lying depression area, and there's hills surrounding this little lake and this bog. And this is what the boardwalk looks like. So there's actually quite a bit of diversity out here. And one of the things that we manage our DNR lands for is plant biodiversity, right? So biodiversity is really the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So we're talking about different species, plant, animal, any kind of organism with more diverse numbers, meaning there's more species that live in that habitat. So let's look at some of the plants that live out in a bog. One, we have this pitcher plant, and pitcher plants, many people know they have sort of a trap. So they're a cup-shaped leaf, and an insect will fall into that cup, and then it has a really hard time flying out or getting out, climbing out. The plant uses the nutrients from the insect as its nutrition source. So there's nitrogen and phosphorus in our insect friends, and that's actually how the plants get their nutrition. A bog is a unique environment. That sphagnum moss doesn't really allow for a good breakdown of the soil. It's an acidic base, and so that prevents a lot of the decomposition that you would see in regular soil. So plants have to get creative and find different ways to get their nutrition. So this is actually a picture of what we call bladder wart. And so here's an up close picture of that bladder wart. You can see those little balloons. These little, let me find my laser. These little white balloons actually act like a sensitive turkey baster. So there's little bugs in the water, and the turkey baster, when a bug touches the balloon, the turkey baster slurps up the water around it, and all those little bugs end up inside. So you can kind of see those little bugs swimming around. Another plant that we have in our bog is roundleaf sundew. So these actually many of the plants that live in the bog, their sugars that would normally be stored in the root systems get stored in the leaves. And so the sugars in the leaves actually are sticky. And when a fly lands on one of those sticky leaves, right, it actually gets stuck. So it's going to get stuck right to the sticky, it's almost like a thick honey. And then the plant will use the nutrients that they can get in the bug for their nutrition. So here's an up close picture of that, of the sundew there. So we call this an adaptation, right? So this is like a tool or an action or process of an organism to adapt to its environment. So here is 3 other versions of plants that live out in the bog, and these all have kind of adapted in a different way. So a bog in the summertime can be really open and sunny, and then in the winter it's pretty cold and covered in snow. So these plants have really kind of leathery leaves. We have a bog birch on the left, bog rosemary, and a tamarack tree. And all of them have kind of waxy coated leaves that are very protective of their moisture. So in the summer sun, they hold on to their moisture. And in the cold of the winter, bog plants tend to be low to the ground, and they also get covered with snow. So they have sometimes like a protective fuzz to them. So these guys are kind of waxy and coated in, well, some of them are coated in fur. So those are other adaptations that you can find in one habitat. So there's other kinds of habitats that we have in Waterloo. Beech maple forests were formed in places that are kind of protected. So they're in lower areas that are protected by either wetlands or landforms like hills or eskers. And they have, you know, a variety of different species that live there. And many of those species have adapted to live in that particular environment. So here's 2. We have a Scarlet Teenager, and these guys will fly around looking for bugs or larvae or moths or other kinds of insects. And they use a beak that's kind of good for that. So their beak is kind of like a set of tweezers. They go around flying and catching their food or finding it in the bark of a tree, or taking it from, you know, a seed or a nut, something that they can use their tweezer-like beak to eat. Oops, sorry, I missed a guy here. So the Blandings turtle, this is actually mostly an aquatic turtle. They spend an awful lot of time in the water, but they like smaller little wetland areas, and those smaller little wetland areas are oftentimes found in a forested area. So many times we can see a Blandings turtle walking from one place in our beech maple forest to another place in our beech maple forest. Their carapace, or their shell, is pretty protective. They can't really close it up like some of our other land turtles, but it's a big carapace. So we know that they spend a decent amount of time on land. And so their legs and head can be protected inside that bigger carapace. And then here's a picture of an oak hickory forest. So this is just another habitat that we have. And oak hickory forests oftentimes will be on up higher, so up on the tops of hills. So on some of our moraines, we've got some more sandy, rocky soil, and the oak hickory trees will be found there. And so here are 2 examples of animals that live in that type of a forest. We have a blue jay, and of course, a blue jay's beak is a little bit bigger. So he can use that beak kind of like a nutcracker, right? So he's got a beak that can open up acorns or other kinds of seeds, and is also happy to eat other insects and things that are found in the forest. But he can use that bigger beak to his advantage. And then this is an eastern box turtle. So crawling along the forest floor, oftentimes we'll find box turtles, and they are a true box turtle, meaning they have a hinge on their bottom of their shell. And so they can get their legs, all 4 of their legs and their head kind of inside. And then they use their hinge to kind of close up their shell, so they're really protected in there. So that's kind of how they've adapted to live in this environment. So here's a picture of a marsh, and Portage Marsh is our marsh here in Waterloo. And Portage is a little bit unique. There's a steady stream of water that flows through that marsh. So because of that, we get this unique turtle that will often be found in the marsh. So this is a spiny softshell turtle, and these guys are really flat, so they can get into those shallow areas, right, without being detected. And if you look at his beak or his nose there, it's really long, and so he can stick his nose up out of the water to breathe and keep himself underneath the water, protected from predators. So that's kind of the way that they can get into like the really shallow places and find food. This bird here is a marsh wren. So a marsh wren actually has an even tinier beak. So here's a tiny pair of tweezers, right? And so this guy will find seeds or little gnats or mosquitoes to eat, but also a lot of macroinvertebrates that are in this marsh water. So a tiny beak for tiny little things that they eat. And then here's a kettle lake. So we have a lot of kettle lakes around Waterloo, and they have a lot of vegetation growing around the edges of the lakes, also vegetation growing in the lakes. And so here we have a great blue heron using his more of a big stabbing scissor-like beak, right, to get his meal. They spend a lot of time waiting and hunting and waiting for fish to come swim nearby so that they can have a meal. And then the turtle up here, the snapping turtle, also has ways that he can use this lake to his advantage. So his bottom shell, or his plastron, is really small. That means that he can swim using all of his legs better than a turtle that spends more time on land. So having a small plastron makes it easier for swimming around. All right, so I have 4 different animals here, and I've got 2 habitats. So I'm going to turn this into a pen, and I'm pretty sure that you guys can make comments about where these animals live. So here we have a turkey, right? So this turkey probably doesn't spend too much time in the water, so we know that it would be in the beech maple forest. This guy is a muskrat. So muskrats spend a lot of time near cattails. And so cattails you can find near a lake. This is a largemouth bass, and obviously this bass has to live in the lake too. So he's from the Kettle Lake. And then a red squirrel, though they might live near a lake, they probably spend more time in the trees. So here's the red squirrel. So he would live over here in the beech maple forest. So here's some of the foods that these guys might eat. So I wonder if we can take a look at, you know, just the variety of foods that are available, and then maybe sort them out into what these guys would prefer. So it's funny, you know, we think about animals really preferring 1 or 2 types of foods, but most of these guys actually will eat almost anything on this list here, on this menu. So this turkey, when they're young, they actually will be happy to eat caterpillars, right? So they can eat caterpillars, but a lot of their diet, especially in the fall, is acorns or beech nuts or seeds, especially older turkeys. The red squirrel there will definitely spend a lot of time eating seeds or fruits or acorns or other kinds of nuts. The bass, of course, will eat other smaller fish, lots of bugs, any kind of larva that they find. And so a lot of variety in that diet. And then also the muskrat here. So the muskrat spends a lot of time eating the roots of cattails, but will also eat insects or nuts or seeds or anything else that it finds. So here's kind of a breakdown of what, you know, these animals might be eating in the various habitats of Waterloo. So habitats are important to people and their recreation too, right? So we've got a lot of different recreational opportunities available to us in Waterloo and in Michigan State Parks. And there's, you know, appropriate activities to do in certain habitats. So like a forest, you probably wouldn't want to go boating in a forest. You'd probably use a lake for that. If you're a skier, you most likely will spend time in a hilly area. If you like to go camping, you're probably not going to go camp in a lake. You might want to camp near a lake, but you might also want to camp in a forest. So each activity really has the right habitat for that activity. So we're going to play a little bit of a goofy game here. I'm going to show you some pictures. So here is, this is a Massasauga, an eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. And the Massasauga and the blanding or spotted turtle both have adaptations that are similar to the way that people use adaptations. So if we're going to go biking, we might use similar tools or adaptations to snakes. So the snake scoots, or the scales on the belly of the snake, oftentimes help the snake grip the ground around it to move it forward. It's the same way that bike tires work to get us moving to where we want to go, right? So this snake tire, or this bike tire, is actually called the Pro Snake Belly. Here's a picture of the way that we use helmets, right? So here I am wearing my bike helmet, similar to the way that the spotted turtle uses its helmet for protection, right? For spotted turtle from predators and us from our accidents. Here's two aquatic mammals. And these guys we take our cues from them when we're talking about recreation in the water. So if you look at their feet, they have webbing in between all of their toes. And that webbing works out really well, just like a paddle, right? So here's a paddle for kayaking. And it sort of mimics the webbed feet of aquatic mammals. People also use PFDs, or life jackets, right? The life jacket helps keep us warm, but it also helps us float. So the fur of these aquatic mammals kind of has like an oily sheen to it, and that oily sheen helps protect them and keep them waterproof. And they also have a lot of extra fat on their bodies, and that helps them with floating. So when they're in the water, they're a little more buoyant than people. So here are some white-tailed deer, and this is what they kind of look like in the wintertime. So they use that adaptation of camouflage to blend in with their surroundings in the winter. So they're more of that grayish color in the winter, and their coat's a little bit thicker. And so that helps them blend in with the bare trees and sticks and shrubs. So you can barely see that deer on the right in that picture. And then in the summer, they lose that thicker coat and they replace it with a thinner coat. It's kind of like air conditioning, but it's also more of a golden reddish color. And that sort of mimics the sunshine in a field and helps them blend in with more of the summer colors. Here's another picture of some camouflaged animals. So these wild turkey, they definitely blend in color-wise with their surroundings, but they also have different patterns on their bodies. And when we have different patterns, it helps kind of break up the outline of an animal. And so if the outline is kind of broken up into different patterns and colors, then it's more difficult for a predator to see that animal. Here's some kids that came to a class of mine, and they actually blended in really well into the woods. So they're wearing muted colors, natural colors, and they also have camouflage patterns on their clothes. So that breaks up the outline of their human form. All right, so we have to manage these parks in a way that's good for the wildlife, the threatened and endangered species. It has to be usable, right? So we need the resources from our parks and our public lands. And then it also has to be a really fun and safe place for people to recreate. So we have to balance all of these things. And the DNR uses a management plan. And so this management plan breaks down the park into different zones, and each of these zones have different activities that can and cannot be done there, right? So in this map, you can see that the primitive zone, or the light green, that mint green color, is a big portion of the park. And so primitive zones are dispersed recreation, right? There's really not any trail systems or any amenities of any kind in those parts of the park. And so they're really kind of preserved for habitat protection and unique species. Then there's the backcountry zone. So the backcountry zone is that lime green color, and you can see that's a really big portion of the park as well. And so, oops, here's a picture of the primitive zone. And the lime green sections have some things like a trail running through them, but they really don't have any buildings or places where a lot of people would congregate. So they're ways to get from one place to another through nature. So natural resources are really the feature, but recreation is part of the activity that's done there. So the natural resource recreation sections are the dark green, the forest green sections. And those are more heavily used. So those would be like trail systems that get used a lot, trailheads, maybe some of our lodging that's kind of out of the way of the regular campgrounds. And then we come to the red section. So the developed recreation sections are the heavily used high traffic areas. So you can see that even though this park is really big, there's only certain small areas that are set aside really for people to have a lot of say in what happens there. So there's, beaches and campgrounds and toilet buildings in those red sections. So here's an example of what a primitive zone looks like. There's really no trails. This is just nature at its finest. And then this is that backcountry zone. So you can see the trails that go through there, but there's really not a whole lot else besides trails and trailheads. That natural resource recreation zone has maybe some more heavily used trails, but also some of our cabins and other alternate lodging, and also rustic camping. And then this is kind of what we say is our developed recreation. So these are the places that are like heavily used by people, and sometimes they can be overdeveloped. So it's a balancing act trying to keep all of these different zones separate and make sure that one zone isn't bigger than it needs to be. So here's kind of that breakdown of what a management plan is. The goal is to get, a lot of the park available for the plants and animal species that live there, and then heavy use in just smaller areas. Pardon me. One of the things that we want to manage for, one natural thing that happens is just the process of succession. So over time, a forest that used to be a small shrubby area has become a grown-up, mature forest. And so that's just something that when we look at management plans, we want to make sure we take into account. Another thing that we want to look at is invasive species management. So you can see that these are plants that are not native to Michigan and don't live here or didn't start here. And so they've kind of taken over the understory of these different forests. And so if you take over the understory, that means there's no room for the native plants. So that's another part of the management plans is what to do with our invasive species. There's also the problem of overuse. So oftentimes our parks are used more than we would like them to be in certain areas. So then we have to talk about increasing maybe some of those zones that are heavily used by people. And then another problem that happens is anytime that we develop roads or drives or pathways, sometimes there are consequences like we've broken up a habitat or a migration pattern for turtles from one body of water to another. So we want to make sure that we plan for those kinds of things. Pardon me. And then the other thing that they look at is there a way that we can manage some of our native places to make sure that they stay the way that we want them to be. So our oak hickory forests, they go through a process of prescribed burning that helps nutrients get released into the soil and helps us remove some of our non-native species. And then also some of our trailheads have these boot brushes that remove seeds from plants that we don't want to spread from one area to another. So the management plans really do help us kind of focus our energy onto the really important, the reasons that we have the parks and how we keep them nice and usable by both plants, animals, and humans, right? So I thank you today for coming out and listening to me talk about human impacts and adaptations and biodiversity. And I think there's probably some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Katie. That was awesome. I learned a lot, and I thought I knew a bunch about your park. So we have quite a few questions today. So I'll start with what's at the top. First of all, Christine says, what is your favorite Kettle Lake in the park?
Oh, well, my local Kettle Lake is Mill Lake. So Mill Lake is not the biggest lake, but it's really pretty, and there's a trail that goes around it. So that's, I guess, the one I'm most familiar with. So it's kind of it's my home base. It's my home lake.
Mill Lake.
Mill Lake.
Awesome.
Yep.
Somebody asked, what were the turtle and the snake in the first slides? I don't remember what they were.
I can think about it. The Blandings turtle. So with the yellow neck, right? Oh, in the first slide. It was actually probably in the threatened and endangered slide, it was the spotted turtle and eastern Massasauga.
Oh, which leads us to another question. I heard that your park has poison snakes. Is that true? Is it safe to hike and camp there?
Yeah, so there's one venomous snake in Michigan, the eastern Massasauga, and it has been found in our park. The last true sighting was in the 1960s, but there's really good habitat for Massasaugas, and in nearby parks, there's Massasaugas that have been found. So we probably have them.
Neat. Even though pitcher plants get their nutrients from the insects, do they still photosynthesize?
They do. They have green leaves. So yes, they are still doing photosynthesis. Yep.
We have so many questions, I've got to scroll down. Can we ride our horses in Waterloo?
Yeah, we have a pretty extensive system of horse trails, and they're separate from mountain bikers. So we don't have to worry about that. But you can also rent a horse. So we have a stable with a concessionaire that rents out rides.
I want to do that. Somebody actually mentioned in the chat that this park looked huge on your management plan map.
Yeah.
Is it one of the biggest in the state?
Yeah, so Waterloo is the third largest state park. There are two in the UP that are bigger. So we're the largest in the mitten part of the state. And if you combine Waterloo and Pinckney, it's a really big area of biological diversity that we want to protect and make sure that it stays there and stays well managed.
Pinckney's near you?
Yep, Pinckney is actually really connected to Waterloo.
Okay. What is your favorite bog plant and why?
Wow. Well, we get a couple of unique orchids out there, and I have a friend who comes to visit sometimes. He's a little guy, and he is really into orchids, and his favorite is the Arethusa, which is the dragon's mouth orchid. So it's got a cool name, and it's pretty pink. So.
And the last one, what kind of threatened or endangered species are at Waterloo?
Well, the eastern Massasauga. Blandings turtles are on our state threatened list, I think, or species of special concern. We do have spotted turtles, and so that's another one.
Any plants?
Yeah, lots of lots of plants. Some unique trees. Yeah.
Well, I want to go visit. So everybody, thanks for joining us today. I wanted to close with sharing with you guys a couple other spots you could go to find some neat things that we have for you. Number one, you guys already found Nature at School. That's how you signed up for the webinar today. We'll be offering more at the end of January in 2021, for a couple months at least. If you're bored on the weekend, you're bored after school, we've got Nature at Home that has everything from books to read that are about nature, videos all of our staff like Katie have put together, our professional educators throughout the state. It has nature bingo, scavenger hunt, more lessons you can do at home, experiments. It's a really cool site. And then lastly, just for a daily dose of fun, we have our My Nature DNR Facebook page, which we post on every day. Little tips, cute things, and getting to know Michigan and our resources. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming today. Thank Katie for sharing all of her information, and we hope to see you in January. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.